This lecture series is entitled Practice. And so for this lecture, I focused on our own practice and what's unique about it in terms of the environments that we practice in and the design philosophies and processes that we follow. And this is in the context of Columbus. So this is going to be about what you can accomplish in Columbus and how we tried to do that. So by environments, I'm talking about a number of aspects. The financial environment, economic environment, those are different. The regulatory environment, and the demographic environment. And I think you'll see from these slides that our design philosophies and processes are very much informed by a wide range of influences from conceptual art to building codes. Equally important, actually. So I thought I'd try to give you some insight into what it's like to try to do good design and accomplish significant work in a market like this in Columbus, at least what it's like for us and how we approach that challenge. And I'm backing up because everything you see is the result of very much a collaborative process from beginning to end in all aspects of these projects. And the collaborators, Jeremy Little, Tracy Perry, Stephanie Hayward, are very much to thank for a lot of what you see here. So, the economic environment. It's interesting to recognize that some of the very things that makes Columbus an attractive place to live also make it more difficult for architects to do good work. The Consumer Price Index is a common gauge for, that's what we pay for retail goods exclusive of housing, a common gauge for cost of living. What does it cost to live somewhere? And as you can see, compared to other cities and regions, Columbus has nearly the lowest in the region, just above Detroit. So it's an inexpensive place to live. And if you look at the rent index, average rents in these same cities, and when you're looking at residential construction, particularly apartments, the relatively low cost to rent here puts pressure on the design and construction process to keep costs low. You can see that Columbus has a lower average rental rate than most Midwestern cities and by far lower than cities across the country. So what does that mean in terms of residential projects, apartments, multifamily? Reduced rental income translates to reduced expenses, i.e. construction costs, and that again squeezes it presents a challenge to do good design. And this is what, multifamily residential construction costs look like in these same cities and across the country. Columbus sits in about the lower third compared to these cities, both regionally and nationally. So again, these lower costs are good for renters, but a challenge for achieving good design. Not that you can't do good design on a budget. We've trained ourselves to do that over many years. It just poses a challenge. That's part of the context that we work in. So in addition, there's a few more factors to consider. The financial environment right now is such that both the debt and equity funds that are required to do private development are hard to come by. And that often puts a larger share of the burden of a project's upfront costs on the architect. Most architects have experienced that. I'm sure some in this room have. On top of these challenges, the economic and financial challenges is a high degree of regulation in Ohio and particularly in Columbus that adds additional pressure. A large area of Columbus and its surrounding communities are regulated by area commissions, historic review commissions, development and zoning commissions, and a host of neighborhood associations, all with the authority, but not necessarily the expertise, to decide what good design is. So all this together sounds like an impossible challenge, right? Well, it's not that impossible. All I can say is you just have to try harder and keep trying. I realized about 10 years into our practice that that was what it took for us to really start to build a reputation for good design, where people were coming to us for that. So it wasn't a sort of a quick ascent by any means. And I think that the following projects will show that you can get to good design without the expensive materials and details necessarily that are afforded by a fat budget. So let's start with a more recent project in our office. This one will start construction hopefully in about a month. This is a single-family residence in Powell, about 3,200 square feet. It's on an ex-urban site, a suburbanized farmland. This was farmed, the lots were split off. Because there are houses on each side of not really incredible note, and there's still a wood to the back. Oh, sorry. There we go. We opted initially for a courtyard approach to this design, so we could frame the desired views to the woods in the rear, focus inward and away from the neighbors. In this way, this illusion of remoteness was maintained. It's a little dim, isn't it? But I think you can see the courtyard building, the woods to the back. And this courtyard plan really evolved, and I'm trying to show here the steps in which we evolved it to the current plan that we'll start building shortly. Started with the sort of typical courtyard plan. There we go. The conventional figure of the courtyard. We separated then the garage portion and the sort of master suite from the main living area. Then further, we separated from that living area sort of functional pieces, stair, bath, kitchen, from the main living area, as well as a private outside courtyard, leaving just a large volume for the main living space. So at that point, what we really wanted to do is let's open this up to the outside, both in front and in back. So we really wanted to sort of dematerialize that as much as possible, open it up to the environment front and back. But then, of course, we had to deal with a privacy issue, both to the neighbors on either side, but also to the access road, which, if you remember, comes straight towards the building. So we wanted to create some privacy, so we sort of thickened that wall here towards the outside. Okay? That leads to this plan, which replicates that last figure, I think. So what I want to note here simply is that we kept a lot of the functions to the interior, leaving the perimeter open for circulation. That does a few things. It opens up the exterior so we can get as much windows and light in as we can where we want to. But it also does something that we try to do probably in almost all of our residential work, whether it's single family or apartments or condos in a warehouse, wherever. And that is we try to extend the views. I mean, I think people tend to like big spaces, even if they can't afford them or there's not the room to create that. So we try to lengthen views. So these sort of corridors, right, open corridors, end typically with either windows or an object like a stair. So you really get kind of long views all the way through the house. You'll see that in the very last rendering. Second floor. I didn't really talk through the functions, but we have a couple bedrooms up here, as well as a sort of a entertainment sort of music room. Back to the first floor. Again, the master suite is on the right, garage, kitchen, and bathroom, etc. Now notice something here that's different. There's something that's missing, intentionally missing. There is no entry foyer. There is no front door on the building. We were working within a budget, so we had to eliminate something, and we didn't want to eliminate living space. We didn't really want to spend living space on an entry foyer, which is a conventional suburban sort of device that really most people don't have a whole lot of use for. So it's gone. And along with it went the front door. We didn't want to have one door be the entry to, say, the kitchen area or this living area, whatever. So we didn't have one door, we had several, right? So the entry to this house is here and here and here. So we'll see what the mail carrier in Powell has to say about that. Section showing the courtyard to the right. This wall in front that we sort of closed down a little bit still has windows above, and this is sort of a thickened wall for storage. So there's the front, without the front door. And this was really kind of a study in figure ground, sort of using darker materials and lighter materials. Interestingly enough, we are attempting to use what is known as Shosugiban. Does anybody know what that is? Because I saw it in a project in the vertical studio, in the comprehensive studio, excuse me. This is a Japanese method originally of charring wood. It's a way to protect wood, and it lasts a lot longer, and it looks cool. So in the next 2 weeks, we'll be doing a little experiment on site. I'll let you know how that happens. But the process essentially is to char the wood. They used to do it with newspapers in Japan. We use a roofing torch. Char it, scrape it down, wash it, oil it, put it up. That's what we're going for. This is a view from the west. This is basically the garage. We were really trying to, you'll see this, I guess, in this slide, really trying to maintain that, that perimeter corridor effect, and in some cases it actually causes to push the corridor to the outside. Well, in this case, it's not the corridor. This is actually, excuse me, this is actually a storage, some closets. Whoops, I'm going to try and learn how to use this. Storage here. That actually pushes outside of the perimeter of the building. Going around to the courtyard itself, trying to use as many windows as possible and doors, etc. Bedroom wing. That's the lovely east facade, which the neighbor to the east may like, may not. And the interior. This shows you a little bit more clearly what I was talking about in terms of the sort of lengthening the views. This is, you're in the back corner of the building, the southeast corner. So down the bedroom wing, straight shot toward the window. Same thing this way. That's what we were trying to achieve. So let's move on to a sort of small office project that was completed last year, late last year. This is Resource Interactive Offices in the Brewery District, the Moline Plow building. You might know their offices exist there. It's a 3-story masonry building. They took over part of the first floor for client meeting spaces and staff meeting spaces. This is a very simple project, not inexpensive, but simple project that was really a matter of organizing 2 types of spaces, the staff meeting rooms and the client meeting rooms. We organized that around a central corridor, using that as a datum, and we used materials, ceiling materials and floor materials to try to codify these spaces, the 2 different types of spaces. You're looking at the reception area there. So that's the diagram. This is part of the first floor again. Staff spaces are green, client, including the entry, in orange, all access through this corridor, which actually is kind of visually extends through the building. Again, here we are trying to kind of extend the view to kind of get more space out of the space. So that gets realized in the ceiling pattern and materials. Wood slat ceiling all the way down the corridor in the kind of client entry lobby and a large this is a training space and a client meeting space. So the clients can kind of identify their spaces with that ceiling. The staff spaces have these drywall clouds. Floor has the same sort of role in terms of defining these spaces. These are carpet tiles. And the center corridor here is a porcelain tile as well. And there we go. This is that sort of top or north meeting space. I'm sorry, that's the south one. They look very similar. Exposing materials, we just ground the concrete floor. A lot of this is about furniture. The wrapper, the existing brick walls were just painted to be neutral. There's the corridor itself. With this is sort of like some interactive 4-panel screen. There it is. And you can see the ceiling as well. And in the training room, that ceiling wraps down to the back of the wall. Very simple project. And that entry off of Front Street is basically also a neutral space. We didn't want to sort of play the color game in here. This is all aluminum tile on the floor and at the storefront as well. Okay, this I want to show you kind of gets to one of the themes I wanted to talk about tonight, and this idea of sampling or making references. In this case, we have a couple of conceptual artists that we look to for inspiration. I'm not trying to claim that we're doing what they're doing by any means. We're taking it as a sampling and we're using it in ways that I think informs the design of the building. And you'll see how that was, in my opinion, sort of a natural fit. That being, so let me explain. This is a creative agency. This is in Grandview. Maybe a lot of you have seen it. This was a renovation of 2 houses into their offices. They were working in there before, but didn't look much like this. So, excuse me, house, and connector in the middle. This is kind of what we started working with. Not much to really look at. The idea here was not to tear this down and start with a new building. We looked at that. We thought it was more challenging and actually, in a lot of ways, economically, in terms of sustainability, more of a challenge and more of an imperative to keep the houses and do as much as we could with them. So it also was a good way to create a transition from the commercial corridor on Fifth Avenue to the residential area behind this site, instead of a sort of an abrupt change with more of a, whatever, you can imagine a glass office building. This kept the residential structures, but kind of renovated them in more of a commercial way. Essentially, the plan is just a lot of creative spaces, whether it's reception or conference offices, open offices, more closed offices in both buildings. This is the connector piece, which was the void between the 2 buildings before we started. And how it opens into these buildings is really the thing. That's what we were going after. That happens on both floors with a bridge across the top. And so it seemed to me that, okay, in terms of what are we going to do with this building, I thought, if Gordon Matta Clark were here, what would he do? I don't know what that means. What would W do? But if you know Gordon Matta Clark, and you should, conceptual artist from the 60s and 70s who basically had his way with old buildings in ways that turned him into sculpture. I won't go into sort of the art analysis of that, but in terms of revealing certain things with buildings and their structure, that to us was a really interesting reference for us to use. As well, a more recent one, I admit this is sort of after the fact, but I could not help but put this in. This is, I'm going to catch up to my notes if you don't mind. It's called the Black Pearl Project in the Netherlands. Studio Rolf are the architects. Look closely about that. That is just one weird building. It's an existing building with new openings that really have paid no attention to the original openings. I would show you the interiors, but I really didn't get into that. That's the kind of idea. In terms of fenestrating this building, these buildings, that's the sort of approach we took. We put them where we wanted to, regardless of really where the structure was behind. Not something you would normally do. So the fenestration approach was really one of using the existing openings, okay, which if you could see are the dotted lines here. Some of them we closed up. A lot of them we actually connected with new openings. So these are really kind of new ciphers on the exterior facade that really disregard the structure and connect certain spaces, okay? And we thought that was also appropriate. It's a graphic design firm. I don't like to be literal about that sort of thing. It seemed to make sense. So this is some of Gordon Maddox Clark's work, which you're probably familiar with, ones that we thought made sense for us to be looking at. This is conical intersect on the left, Baroque office top right, and four-way wall below. Just really interesting how he creates space within these sort of typical conventional structures that is anything but. So our first move was figure out how to open these buildings, these two structures, to that new connector space. So, of course, the natural thing to do is just cut a big, huge hole times 2. It's really a kind of a fractured sphere in 3 dimensions that opens this center hallway up to, basically both floors, creating all sorts of new views and spaces that didn't exist. And that is a view of the corridor itself with a bridge above. I didn't really mention the cladding, and I should have, but you can see it here on the inside as well. Because these existing houses were sort of all over the place, I mean, the forms were anything but sort of, it didn't make much at all. We didn't want to square them off. We wanted to leave them the way they were, but we wanted to bring some cohesiveness to the project. So basically, we cladded everything, all the exteriors as well as these kind of new exteriors right within this hallway with cement board siding. It was a detail that we invented. This is part of the let's do this cheap. This is a rain screen, but a detail that we invented. Simply cement board siding with a aluminum Z-clip there, and that covers basically everything. The view looking back to the entry. And this, basically this connector, it's a functional connector in terms of connecting the spaces, obviously. It's an orientation device. It also brings a whole lot of daylight into what was a really kind of a dark environment. That whole thing is clad, front and ceiling with polycarbonate. Looking through that fractured sphere, where we sort of made the incisions, we left them as raw as possible. We didn't leave the sort of joist space open, but we did kind of close them where we had to with just simple plywood. But you can see the sort of built-up siding as well. So you can see how the kind of remnants of the circle kind of make some kind of odd circumstances, conditions. Looking up through the fractured sphere. Now, let's see if this works. Tim promised me it would. Just to give you an idea of what it's actually like to walk through the space, because it's very much about the three-dimensional experience. Very difficult to draw, by the way. Without Revit, this would have been impossible. Gets me dizzy sometimes when I watch this. And there you go. So next, what else do we do with these interiors? We looked at codifying the interiors with colors in terms of, outside versus inside, or one side versus the other. And it really became, that exercise became more a matter of what do you do when you expand the spaces with these carvings, right? These new voids. And we realized that with color, we could start to collapse them at the same time. And you'll see some other examples of this. But our reference was Georges Rousse, who was a French photographer. Is anybody familiar with his work? It's freaky. That's all I can say. It's really wonderful stuff. And it's a way of taking three-dimensional space and collapsing it. These are not Photoshops. These are not flat artworks. These are actual three-dimensional spaces that he creates, obviously by painting, but from a single perspective. So he paints it, he takes a photograph, and that's what you get. And that's real. And that's real. And that takes a long time, I'm sure. And those are real. I mean, you need to look at these for a while to really imagine what it takes to do this sort of thing. But it's a way of taking that three-dimensional space and collapsing it to 2 dimensions. So now it's really interesting to see one that is one of his, from the correct perspective and from another perspective. They make no sense from the wrong perspective. So again, I'm not Georges Rousse, but we wanted to make reference to this in a way that starts to take these expanded spaces with the carving, with the new voids, and collapse them by layering color. So this is what you see from the second floor, and this is kind of the image that we wanted to achieve, how it starts to, we use the shape and color to start to collapse that space. Some more shots from the interior. In two places, I believe, we took the valleys, corner valleys, brought them up with a flat roof where we gained a lot more space in the attic, and this is one of them. So this shows you that another example of that sort of a detail of that carving in which, it's really at times kind of hard to tell what orientation walls are in. But it's also interesting how it sort of creates views through the building in ways that really aren't typical or even natural for that matter. Moving on to a project, new construction. These are townhomes. This is in Brewer's Gate. I feel like you've all seen these before. You just kind of drive around town and you can see this stuff. So I'm not showing you anything that you probably haven't seen before, but maybe I can show you what we thought behind it. So these are 35 units on 1 acre in the Brewer District on Front Street. These are all single townhomes, connected townhomes. 5 buildings creating courtyards between. And we really opted to use this sort of perpendicular arrangement for the buildings rather than creating a long bar along the street or a courtyard building, because you do that and the first thing you want to do is break the building up on the facade to try to make references to the existing scale of the neighborhood. Instead, we wanted to make references to that scale, to that kind of rhythm of the street with the building form itself. So we turned them perpendicular to the street, which afforded us these new courtyards, which are really pretty useful. Garden courts and auto courts. So it takes the garages off the street, and it also gives us green space, which is not that common for this kind of a project in this kind of a neighborhood. But it was this kind of rhythm, right, that we were trying to emulate, albeit at a little bit larger scale, because these units are turned parallel to the street rather than perpendicular as they are typically with these houses, so that makes them a little bit longer. And I'll get back to towards the end of this series about what you do with a roof that's that wide. Site plan showing the garden court, half garden court, and the auto courts. Floor plans. Now what's interesting, I'll go back for a moment. So it's a splayed street condition for reasons I want to go into. We wanted to have a frontal presence on those two streets, which means we had to kink these buildings somewhere, which was actually a real advantage because it allowed us to present those facades to the street in a little bit more frontal way. It just makes those courtyards more interesting. The interiors, quite frankly, are pretty conventional. That was client-driven partly, but this was also the market. You have to pay attention to the market. This isn't a loft. This is a townhome. So you're not seeing anything here that you wouldn't expect in a lot of places. Garage, there's a study, stair. This is kind of living, kitchen, dining, and bedrooms above. As well as the finishes are pretty straightforward. That's an example of the garden court itself. So most of the entries, except for the end units, are on these courts. And I'll explain a little bit about, kind of what these things do, especially this guy here. Simple materials. The original scheme had a lot of metal. That metal wrapped all the way down. Again, it was sort of a process of a negotiation in which we sort of probably made more references to the existing brick neighborhood. So the end units, the ends of these buildings, interesting about these things, well, the roof itself, is really a flat gable. I really wasn't comfortable exposing that. It's really flat. I don't like flat gables. It looks a little bit strange. and we were trying to kind of get away from some of the sort of typical building types here. So we used some devices here with that gable, but also the fenestration. I just want to point out we were looking to the neighborhood, as you all do a lot of your projects, I'm sure, in terms of taking cues for fenestration, both the Italianate houses and the adjacent warehouse structure, in terms of the proportions and this kind of triple window bay. That's not to say it was we were trying to repeat that. It was just really a kind of our construction lines, our sort of pattern that we were working with. Anyway, beyond the fenestration itself, which took those references, it was this pop-up, right, which is a pop-up in the bedroom, and this stucco wall, which we used as devices to sort of disguise that flat gable. I mean, a pretty simple device. Okay, moving on to some other housing. I'm sure you've all seen this. You've been downtown. The Brunson building is 22 stories. I'm sorry, 22 stories. 22 units, 13 stories. This is a Chicago-style office building originally that we created an addition for. And actually, this is another project that was a second phase of condos as well, above the parking garage. This was really our first use of this idea of a para building, which, if you also know, is it's a term that was coined by Herbert Muschamp in the New York Times some time ago to talk about an addition that or intervention that transforms the essential character of the original or host building. Our interpretation has been a little bit different than that, as opposed to some of these buildings, the Porter House by Shop Architects, Hamburg Philharmonic by Herzog de Meuron, and Soldiers Field by Carlos Zapata. We try to create more of a relationship, albeit a compositional relationship between the host and the parasite or the para building. In this case, the idea was really to kind of look at the fenestration and the spandrel panels of this older building and kind of make reference to them in new materials with a new architectural language, being glass mostly and steel. That's a glass spandrel with a two-tone paint. I've always kind of looked at this like a motion blur. That's how I kind of see it. You know, to me, it's kind of like looking at that original building and seeing how it sort of, you can pull across the horizontal components in a new way. That's kind of how we saw this. These are basically 2 units per floor. That's north, that's south. This one is open front to back. Again, that idea of expanding space, getting as large a space as you can within these. Otherwise, I mean, working within an existing building, you get some fairly conventional spaces. Again, the balconies themselves were extended to also sort of blur that north edge of the building. That's the view out towards the balcony. Probably the best views downtown, I think. Interesting kind of structural aspect to this. The new building is steel, of course. It needs to be independent from the original masonry structure because the building code requires, if it were attached, the old building would have to meet the seismic code, which would not be easy. You'd have to build a lot of structure in that existing building, which you would definitely not want to do. So the buildings are actually separate. They actually move separate. And my structural engineer tried to scare the hell out of me at our first meeting and tell me that the building is going to move like 6 inches at the top, you know, during high winds. And I believed him. And I'm thinking, well, you know, because the units are, the north unit goes through from the old building to the new. I'm thinking, well, you go through that space and you're like on a high wind, you're like doing the splits or something. Anyway, I'm sure he had fun with how I looked at that meeting, but they don't move at all. But they can. And because they can, we had to introduce this, basically a zipper. It's a movement joint that goes all the way up the building, around and back down the other side. And at every floor, at every opening, there's another movement joint. So these buildings can move together. And in fact, they don't make one of these. So this is actually a movement joint that you use in parking garages. That's the main space of the north unit. So this pair building idea, we sort of continued that with a subsequent project at a smaller scale, obviously. 225 North 4th is also downtown condo building. In this case, we used this ladder device with the storefront glass to separate the buildings because we didn't have that kind of consistency that we did on the Brunson. Otherwise, they're fairly similar. This is 9 units, basically 2 per floor, 1 penthouse up here. That's a garage. That's an office space now. Again, these are 4 units per floor. Tricky part here was the stair is halfway in one building, half in the other. They're 2 different building types, and primarily with the codes, not so much construction, it got fairly difficult. And this garage is basically this kind of drive-through, in this side, out the other. Flipping through this, if you don't mind. We tried to expose a lot of the construction materials and, create them more of an urban kind of loft look, as well as save money, which means on the inside you get exposed block on the walls of the new building anyway, and ground concrete floors. Okay, let's go to Coons Hall, which Karen mentioned in her intro. This is 66,000 square feet. As you know, it's a 1960s Brutalist structure and the new home of the College of Public Health. By the way, all these photographs, except for those 2 in the Malicki project of the detail, were all taken by Brad Feinkoff, so my hats off to Brad as well. This project was really a exercise in how do you beat up an old building to kind of get rid of its problems and make it work with a completely new program. And it certainly fought us the whole way. But essentially the problems with this building were entry and access. It had basically 4 entries on each side of this cube. And they all looked the same. There really wasn't any kind of identity to them. The interior corridor was just a big donut with no light. You could not find your way out of that building. When I was in this building before we started the project and we would have meetings, I just went out a door. I had no idea which way I was going. You have no idea. There was no way to orient yourself inside the building. So it was about entry. It was about interior orientation. And it was certainly about daylight because there was very, very little with all these very small windows. This is a LEED silver building, by the way. So the first thing we did was, the site plan shows you, this is part of the project too, this rain garden, which you'll see later, was figure out a way to sort of open up this building. We chose this method of this kind of large kind of cleaving, cleaved void in the space that served to open up the building to the south to get as much daylight in to the building as possible. At the same time, it connected the new stairs. So we took this original floor plan with these enormous interior stairs that were way oversized and this bank of elevators. We moved the elevators to the east and the stairs to the exterior. So now we have identified entries, we have orientation, clear orientation within the building, and we have daylight coming through. That's the plan itself. I think this is the 3rd floor. That's the large kind of concourse space. In order to get more light deeper into the building, we actually not only carved this slot, right, as part of that kind of cleave, this kind of void, but we also introduced a skylight and an atrium. So the skylight gets more light down into the 1st floor. This atrium is in the 2nd floor, and it just gets light penetrating further into that. Otherwise, in terms of bring more light in, these are all demountable partitions, and these are glass walls, so there's a lot of shared daylight in those corridors. You can kind of see that's the skylight to the first floor, and that's that atrium, double height atrium that lets more light into the second floor. So lots of construction challenges and challenges otherwise. The slot itself, we did not have the ceiling height to put beams to hold up these new slab edges. So our structural engineer, SMBH, Bob Baumer, came up with this brilliant idea of using carbon fiber straps on the bottom at this location of the slab, and carbon fiber rods that were embedded directly above those on the top side of the slab. That's all it took. Night view, obviously. We needed to connect with the existing circulation, which is what this canopy was about, reaching out to the east pathway, existing pathway. And this drains onto these, this canopy drains onto these planing beds. This is the shear wall that we needed. Since we took out the stairs and one of the shear walls on the interior, we needed to replace it here with this exterior shear wall. This has a concrete stain with a gloss coating on it. It's actually very nice. You should see it up close. And the rain garden, which basically collects and filters all of the storm water from all these paved areas into this garden, and has structural soil and all this great stuff that filters out all the bad stuff. The north entry, similarly, we took out the panels, the concrete precast panels here, and this is the new stair with the glass canopy. And that's the stair. Actually, go up in this building, go up to the top floor. These are the best views of that part of campus. The interiors, again, we used some color coding, both on the ground floor, separately from the upper floors, to sort of enliven the space. We had a pretty neutral palette throughout the space, a lot of exposed concrete, and a sort of typical ceiling, so we added some color in the corridors themselves. This is looking down in the atrium, down to the second floor. You can see the green roof, very small, but it's still a green roof, above the entry on the south side. And the light coming in is just really, really amazing. Okay, I would like to hurry through this, and I think that'll be about it for us. This is the Buggy Works, a project that was not built. This is basically a tower project, which was really meant to it was meant to be an icon in this area, sort of by nature of its profile. So we looked at, buildings like that, the Innsbruck Zaha ski tower, ski jump. This is Wolf Pricks in Austria, and this is in Portugal. The idea here was a condo building, tower, and then some apartments above these warehouses, office, retail, and residential. I'll go fairly quickly through these. The apartments had this sort of splayed effect with a kind of a series of views of downtown, whereas the tower itself was rotated to frame views so we could catch the views of some of the taller buildings downtown at a 30-degree angle. Smaller units on the bottom of the tower and larger units, including this sort of large penthouse bridge at the top. And these, interestingly enough, are bi-level offset units. So each floor is an entry of one unit and a sort of a bedroom level of another, so everybody has a private elevator access as these sort of march up this west tower. And some context views. That's a view between these two existing warehouses. And on top of the warehouse to the east, adjacent to the apartments, there's a green roof. That's all I have. I'll certainly take questions.